Park, and I have the privilege of moderating today's panel. Yesterday's symposium focused on AI governance, and we discussed a lot of important and urgent topics related to artificial intelligence. And today, we turn to another urgent topic, AI bias. We often assume that artificial intelligence as a machine is neutral and free from human prejudice. Yet researchers have shown that AI systems can inherit, reproduce, and even intensify human biases because of the data they are trained on and the design choices behind them and the ways they are used. These biases raise critical ethical questions not only about technology, but also about our values, our decision-making, and our relationship with intelligent machines. So today we have two speakers who will address these important issues. Each speaker will speak about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will have a short break, and we will open for the discussions with the speakers and from the questions from the floors. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Mr. Pinis Chantalangsi is a philosopher by training and currently serves as a regional advisor for social and human sciences at the UNESCO regional office in Bangkok, Thailand. His fields of specialization include comparative philosophy, ethics, cultural studies. His work focuses on the role of the social sciences and humanities in sustainable development and ethics of science and technology and human rights and inclusion. In his recent publication, an executive summary issued by UNESCO titled Landscape Study of AI Policies and Use in South Africa, published in 2022, Mr. Chantalangsi assesses the potential benefits and challenges of AI in 9 countries across Southern Africa, and stating that while AI has the capacity to support economic development and strengthen innovation of ecosystems, it also raises significant challenges, particularly given the limited digital infrastructure and the risks to human freedom, autonomy that arise from data misuse. Today, he will speak on the topic, Fast and Slow, Coexistence between Disruptions and Co-evolution with AI. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Pinis Chantalangsi.
Thank you so much, Professor Park, for the kind introduction. I'm very, very glad to be with you this afternoon, but I would like also to share my empathy with you as we are now going into the late afternoon. So I try to be kind and treat you and care you with my first presentation of the session. As you can see, my title, I'm borrowing the term fast and slow from Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And Daniel Kahneman, as you know well, is a psychologist, but also an economist who reflected a lot on biases. But what I will do, and I will try to interrogate the ways in which human societies at large, meaning individuals, firms, governments, perceived and react to the speedy development and deployment of AI today. Such development has been extremely fast, of course, but at the same time, science teaches us that each technology emerges from a very, very long and slow evolution of conditions in nature and society. I believe that to advance our conversation on AI today, we need to take into considerations these two, let's say, paces, the slow and the fast. On the one hand, life on Earth has undergone continuous transformation and evolution since its origin, roughly 3.8 billion years ago. That is the birth or the origin of life. Producing successive more complex forms of information processing, metabolism, and environment shaping behavior. Technology, and especially AI, are not alien in that sense. They're not alien inventions, but extensions of life's capacity to harness physical processes for persistent information storage and manipulation. Reframing AI as a living lineage phenomenon is a consideration that we also need to keep in mind in this presentation. I will ask you to keep in mind that slow evolution. On the other hand, the role of human intentionality must be questioned in such an evolution. If biological evolution has produced bird wings or unique device that we call our eyes, for instance, isn't it that totally different from IT engineers who developed AI technology? The latter's intentions seem to be single human-generated technologies. Thus, philosophical critiques treat the rise of computational systems as a major disruption to social and psychic individuation, raising urgent ethical questions about attention, memory, and collective agency. What is it that, in this particular context of two paces, what is it that essentially is threatened that we need to preserve as human, as an imperative? To examine this question, I will refer to two thinkers. One is Sarah Imari Walker, an American astrobiologist who published a wonderful book called Life as No One Knows It in 2024. She is reflecting on AI technology as the result, I would say a natural result of this very, very long evolution of life. On the other hand, I will also interrogate the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, who has reflected a lot on the notion of disruptions, this other pace which is interrupting this long evolution. Let us start with the first dimension. Complexity in biological systems has repeatedly generated new kinds of persistent information media. For instance, genetic code, nervous systems, languages, even institutions and political institutions. Technologies, including computation and AI, are successive materialization of such a same trend, meaning an engineered media that extend organisms' capacity to store, process, transmit, manipulate information across scales and times. Framing AI as part of an evolutionary continuum emphasizes, therefore, on emergence, contingency, and functional analogy between biological and technological information systems. It also interrogates the concept of intentionality and human essence, you know, all the concepts of dignity, freedom, free will, when it comes to reflecting on humans-machines interactions. If new technologies and the way we interact with them are, quoting, natural, between quotation marks, then it results, and as a result of a long bio and technical evolution, is there any place for ethical considerations and morality then? Who are we, humans, to judge today what is to be preserved and perpetuated for us, meaning for the next generations in this long evolution? So this radical question can find some echoes in Bernard Stiegler's work on the notion of disruption and individuation. So Stiegler thinks that computational capitalism reorganizes attention, labor, and also individuation. He diagnoses epistemic and affective entropy, meaning, in his word, a kind of disorder or chaos produced by attention extractive systems which dissolves shared symbolic culture and weaken the conditions for collective responsibility and individuation. Bernard Stiegler describes disruptions as a technological and socio-economic process that fundamentally reorganizes collective life by altering our attention, our memory, our modes of individuation, producing what he calls pathological effects when left to market dynamics. So this diagnosis reframes AI not only as a continuation of life in a long evolution of 3.8 billion years, but it also simultaneously identified as a force that can erode social capacities developed over human history. It transforms attention into a commodified resource through algorithmic capture and engagement, maximizing architecture, generating concerns for mental health, for instance, also for diminished capacity for sustained reflection. In this sense, disruption concentrates decision-making and normative power in the hands of techno-economic actors. Yesterday, Professor Tae-Won Park called them the super elite, who control infrastructures, producing new asymmetries that limit democratic control and steer societies towards lock-ins and path-independent futures. Now, with regard to facing this analysis by Stiegler, I'd like now to engage in the ethical discussions that is at stake. And this is important for UNESCO because I will end my talk about the role of UNESCO and the multilateral system in this particular context. So you have the long evolution and disruption as described by, on the one hand, Sarah Emiri Walker, and on the other hand, Bernard Stiegler. How do we now reflect on the co-evolution then? The rise of AI reshapes how minds and societies develop by changing the very environments that sculpt attention, memory, and learning. AI-driven attention economies fragment, sustained focus, and rewire cognitive habits, producing path independencies that steer social learning and influence long-term evolutionary trajectories. Our biases that are amplified through the system and algorithm can also in turn influence the long trajectory of human evolution. As everyday interfaces with AI prioritize immediacy and engagement, individuals face new strains on psychic health with potentially diminishing capacities for individualized or personalized or personal reflection, with consequences that compound across generations. Simultaneously, pervasive personalization, and this is the paradox, threatens the shared symbolic frameworks that underpin democratic life that we have known so far. When algorithmic curation atomizes publics into isolated informational niches that self-sustain because of algorithm and biases, individuals that self-sustain individuals as separated atoms, the common ground required for collective deliberation, civic education, but also intergenerational transmission of norms faces risk of erosion. The erosion undermines the processes of collective individuation by which communities form shared meanings and responsibilities, and individuals develop singularities and emancipate from single-handed discourses and systems that are precisely amplified by biases in the algorithmic machinery. These cultural risks are amplified by profound power asymmetries that many of you have already talked about. Corporate control over large-scale AI infrastructures concentrates decision-making power and the ability to set default behaviors, narrowing society's options for adaptive co-evolution. So this is the famous nudge, nudging individuals and societies towards some directions. That can also, in turns, on the long run, influence the long evolution that we've talked about. The resulting technological and institutional lock-ins create irreversible path independencies. One certain infrastructures and business models, for instance, are entrenched in certain patterns or biases. They have high chance to perpetuate bias future development towards outcomes that may marginalize pluralistic human flourishing. And this is something that Professor Yu Sun Ho also talked about in the session when she mentioned the space of appearance, borrowing from Arendt. So the other element is, of course, the environment. Co-evolution must be understood as well as biosocial project. Ecological embeddedness of AI has also to be reflected against the planetary boundaries and multi-species impacts. So to promote long-term planetary and human flourishing rather than short-term extractive gains. So in conclusion of this coexistence and all these ethical stakes that I've just mentioned, let's view AI as the product of a long evolutionary process, because that raises difficult questions about moral status and agency. These debates matter because ethical debates during this transitional phase that we are living today, with fears, anguishes, but also hopes and excitement, this transitional phase will benefit from interrogating the status of our normative frameworks crafted to safeguard human flourishing and ecosystems and integrity so far. And we can just mention one of them. These are the universal human rights frameworks, for instance, that we have also created to preserve and perpetuate what we cherish as value systems. Now, we have to interrogate how do we want to continue or revisit these frameworks today. That requires redesigning governance, economic incentives, social institutions, and emancipating individuals that resist extractive lock-ins, protect shared cognitive and cultural capacities, and preserve the conditions for equitable, reversible co-adaptation between men and humans and technology in the future. Now, UNESCO in 2021, as you have heard, member states of UNESCO, 194 member states, have adopted in 2021 the first UN normative framework, which is the recommendations on ethics of AI. The spirit behind this recommendation lies precisely on the principle of human flourishing, of human oversight and determination of the technology. Such principles require reciprocity in designing systems that support genuine two-way adaptation. On the one hand, human communities must continuously reshape AI through governance and value embedding and oversight, while in return, in ideal situation, AI's affordances should also reshape human practices in ways that are transparent, accountable, and reversible. To sustain the social fabric that makes collective life possible, the recommendation insists in preserving shared symbolic spaces along the line of Bernard Stiegler's ecology. And these are, for instance, schools, public media, libraries, communal rituals that Professor has talked about just before, that carry collective memory, enable deliberations, and transmit norms across generations. But the value of Stiegler, and also highlighting the value of human sciences, the humanities that we are talking about, he's even more radical in his analysis, because he points to some even more important issues that are at stake in the face of increasing human interactions with AI. That relates to stewardship of scarce cognitive resources. Attention stewardship calls for regulations and business model changes that end incentives to monetize distraction and instead favor interfaces and algorithms that scaffold sustained reflection, deep work, civic engagement. In this perspective, concentrations of technological power must be checked through distributed governance. Control of critical infrastructures should be diffused across multi-stakeholders body, public platforms, and we have to promote and allow plurality and avoid that societies are locked into narrow evolutionary path. Now, what can international organizations do? First of all, it is interesting to also reflect that our institutions, international order, multilateral organizations such as UNESCO and United Nations, are also a result of a long evolution of human history. In a sense, they can be also viewed as an institutional technology, a political technology to help us safeguard what we value. And we have done so far with universal framework that keeps us binding together. But 80 years after the United Nations has been created, it is maybe time for us also to reflect and revisit, as we are also facing disruptive technologies, raising all sorts of concerns, and including political concerns on democracy, for instance. Now, I'd like just on that regard to quote beautiful sentences from the UNESCO's constitutions, and I would leave you to reflect on how it relates and resonates quite clearly with us today as we discuss AI. So in the founding text, the foundational text of UNESCO says, and I quote, "The ignorance of each other's ways and lives has been a common cause throughout the history of mankind of that suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world through which their differences have all too often broken into war." Ignorance, suspicion, mistrust, disinformation, misinformation, biases, and algorithm, it resonates. I continue. The wide diffusion of culture, on the other hand, and education of humanity for justice and liberty and peace are indispensable to the dignity of men and women and constitute a sacred duty which all nations must fulfill in a spirit of mutual assistance and concern. So this is a text drafted in 1945, founding UNESCO, giving its mandate to promote culture, education, and sciences as factors that bring us together and binds us. So, in Bernard Stiegler's words, to support collective individuation, our world needs to invest in a public digital commons and civic AI, knowingly open models, shared civic data sets, and community-run platforms like Wikipedia, for instance, that encode pluralistic values and enable democratic uses rather than consumer capture. We need to reform curricula, for instance, to include education for co-evolutionary literacy with technology rather than simply coding that is fashionable today. We should also review the education system and curriculum to include teaching adaptive reasoning, media literacy, system thinking, but also ethical engineering from early stages so that people, children, youth, can steward social technological changes in the future. Finally, we are called upon to explore and set up modalities through which organizations and governments conduct algorithmic impact assessments with long horizon scenarios that analyze second and third order effects on attention regimes of all of us, social individuation, labor ecosystems, and ecological systems, coupled with mitigation plans to prevent harmful lock-ins. So to conclude, I would say that interpreting AI as both a product of a 3.8 billion years of evolutionary trajectory of life, and at the same time as a disruptive force, clarifies that ethical responses must combine humility about deep continuity and also vigilance about contemporary disruptions. Human AI co-evolution should be intentionally steered through institutional design, regulatory interventions, and cultural practices that protect shared symbolic capacity, manage attention, and distribute control. Such a program treats technological emergences as evolutionary opportunities that must be stewarded to sustain human and planetary flourishing rather than surrendered to extractive path dependencies. The most difficult questions remains then, who can make this happen? With our multilateral and global institutions at hand, the one that exists today, how can we make use of them efficiently as we speak? UNESCO also needs you as scientists in the social human sciences, to also ask your governments, ask your institutions to make use of these existing multilateral systems to help us steer this positive co-evolution before it is too late. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chantalangsi, and it's a very intriguing presentation, providing two very different perspectives on AI. AI as one evolutionary stage of a long 3.8 billion years evolution of a human history, or AI as really as a disruption and fragmentation of human attention. So I'm sure that you have a lot of questions to ask during the Q&A session. And I think that today's, during our Q&A, we can really echo many of the issues that we discussed over the 2 days, yesterday and today. Many issues came up regarding AI, and then these two presentations actually kind of echo some of very, very important questions about that. Now let me introduce our second speaker. Professor Bong Rae-seok is the Ne Professor of Philosophy and professor of leadership studies at Albania University in Pennsylvania, US. He earned his PhD from the University of Arizona. His primary research interests lie in the interdisciplinary and comparative philosophy, including philosophy of cognitive science, artificial intelligence, comparative moral psychology, moral neuroscience, neuroaesthetics, and Korean philosophy. In his recent book, in Korean, 인공지능의 미래와 지혜의 알고리즘, The Future of Artificial Intelligence and the Algorithm of Wisdom, published in 2023, Professor Seok develops a comparative approach to artificial intelligence and Buddhist philosophy. He explores the evolution of AI and Buddhist paths to awakening through the concept of the Buddha algorithm. So some of you might be very interested in this. He currently serves on the International Advisory Committee of the AI Society Institute at the Academy of Korean Studies and is the Vice President of the North American Korean Philosophy Association. Today, he will speak on the topic, AI as a moral agent, from the relational viewpoint of coexistence and collaboration. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bong-ne Seok.
Thank you for coming to this last session of the conference. I'm very thankful for the organizing committee and the staff and everyone to make this wonderful, prestigious international conference possible. Today I'm going to talk about research on artificial moral agent. Simply the question there is, can we understand AI or any kind of artificial system as an actor or a person or moral agent? In this case, agent means a thing or system that can think, act, make decisions, and be responsible, be blamed, and be punished, and having certain status. So can we think of that kind of quality, and we recognize and ascribe that to AI or robots? So that's what I like to discuss today. And the discussion consists of this organization, and I'm starting with introduction. And I will discuss 3 different existing suggestions and ideas of moral agency. Moral agency is the quality of moral actor or moral person. And there are 3 of these ideas, as you see on the screen. The first one is called the standard view. The second one is called the functional view. And the third one is called relational view. And these 3 different ideas propose different models, different conceptions, and different understandings of ethical person or agent with regard to AI systems. And then I'm going to discuss one particular view out of 3, which is relational view. Specifically, I will discuss advantage of that viewpoint, and then I will discuss some empirical studies on moral agency, and then I will talk about some implications in non-Western philosophy, and then I conclude. So here's introduction, and I'm gonna skip, let me see. Okay, so sorry about that. I'm going to the last one, okay. So, although systems of AI are designed and programmed by human beings, some systems behave as if they have their own ways of thinking, desiring, and decision-making that are perceived to be the work of independent systems. Simply, they can be understood as agents, right? Systems that can think and act and make decisions. They are not just machines designed by human beings, but also independent agents that can make decisions on their own. So the question there is, can they become a moral person or moral agents? So these days, AI technology is advancing rapidly, and just this year I heard about agentic AI, which is slightly different from the discussion that I have today. But the whole idea there is AI is not just simply processing information, but also making decisions. So that will be another big change in AI industry, as I believe. So the question there, I'm going back, is to achieve this objective of my discussion, I'm going to discuss and analyze current studies of artificial moral agents, and I will specifically talk about 3 different approaches to moral agency, and I will critically evaluate them to see if we have any good ways of understanding their status, their standing, and their agency. And typically the idea there is these are systems that do not have emotions, do not have any type of internal psychological states. Of course, they have some informational processing states, but they do not have any beliefs or desires, and they don't have emotions, and they're probably not going to understand ethics and morality. So how can we give them a certain ethical standard? That's very skeptical and pessimistic. So do we have any positive understanding of moral agency of robotic systems? So here is a quick capture of what I think of simple mechanical system and artificial agents. So to begin with, we can think of robotic arm, right? And it's completely programmed, and it is prescribed to follow certain rules. And if something happens that is malfunctioning, it's just a safety violation. So something goes wrong, it's a mechanical issue. But on the other hand, we can think of advanced AI with certain kind of information processing capabilities, such as autonomous AI, making some decisions on its own. Then what happens is, it's not just a mechanical system, it's an actor. Actor is different from behavior. It's quite different thing. And if that happens, we not only talk about mechanical issues, but more importantly, we can talk about responsibility and blameworthiness, and also moral violation. So probably this table explains the difference between some kind of physical change and mechanical process and decision making. When you go to decision making, it's a totally different dimension, and we can talk about moral violations. So, what are the existing theories of artificial moral agents? The first theory is called standard view. Standard view is typically the traditional understanding of agency. So I'm going to read the whole sentence. The first approach is standard view, which identifies the ability of receiving moral evaluation and taking moral responsibility by laying down specific conditions of being a moral agent, moral actor. According to the standard view, a system with particular inner states, which is very important, such as beliefs and desires and intentions, motivations and expectation, anticipation, and will. So all these internal states combined with the causal efficacy. Causal efficacy is the power to produce certain kind of behavior, kind of action. So if any system having these type of things, we can call it an agent. The best example is human person, I think. Now, if we go to that direction, we have several scholars, including Johnson, in his 2006 article, saying that to be a moral agent should have inner states. That's quite important. Because if we think of action, we always look at where does that come from? the thing that causes the action, not just behavior, should come from inside. And not just inside, it has specific type of psychological states, internal states. And that is our general understanding of action. So that's what standard view says. Now, one example I can say about this view is, for example, judicial system. We have something called the mens rea. Mens rea is a Latin term, criminal mentality, and that follows this general direction of understanding action or agent. For example, a person with conscious understanding and voluntary will commits crime, then the person is morally responsible and punishable. So that's really important principle in criminal justice. Now, the second view is functional approach. Standard view has some issues. I will talk about that briefly before I go to functionalist view. The major issue of standard view is anthropocentrism, which is we impose human standard to machines. Machines are quite different system. Therefore, we, in a way, ascribe the highest standard that any machine can possibly satisfy, because AI or robots have some internal states, but these internal states are quite different from beliefs and desires and intentions and motivations. So although it's a traditional understanding of action and agent, but it's not really helpful to understand artificial agents. So now we come to functionalism. The second approach is functionalist view of moral agency. The functionalist view defines agency from perspective of how a system can act and react to external conditions without specifying their inner states to the level of human psychology. So the advantage here is they don't talk about beliefs and desires. They talk about certain type of functions that helps the system successfully interacting with the environment and making decisions and act on certain things. So they usually list three different conditions: inner activity, autonomy, and adaptability. So inner activity means a system can interact with the environment. It's obviously important. And autonomy means independence. System should be able to make decisions on its own. And the third thing is adaptability. So it should be a system can change its states and functions on the basis of its independent interaction with the environment. So these are general conditions of a functionalist approach. So any system can satisfy these conditions. We can say, hey, that's an agent. That's not just a mechanical system, something that can act and make decisions and be punished. So that's a functionalist approach. And one of the advantages of this approach, as I explained, is to avoid anthropocentrism, and that's a good thing. However, in the second paragraph, the functionalist view has some critical limitation, which is called the responsibility gap. So I'm reading the second paragraph. However, the functionalist view needs to deal with the responsibility gap because agency, the quality of being an agent, and responsibility, the quality of being praised or blamed, are not linked via attributability and inner states that are identified for particular action. The responsibility gap exists in artificial systems. So here is what I say in the situation. So when you talk about agency or person, it should come with attributability. We have to attribute that action back to this origination. The origination is some kind of internal states, but functional viewpoint does not talk about specific internal states, basically certain kind of functions. So because of that, it creates a responsibility gap, which is really typical thing that we have about person, agent, and action. Because again, as I said earlier, when we see someone is making decisions and act, we always saying, what is the cause? What is inside that make that thing happening? But if we talk about just the function, then that internal specification is lacking. So therefore, we cannot ask responsibility fully. So that's the limitation of functionalist view, and we have this responsibility gap. So what is happening here is that these two traditional viewpoints, standard view and functionalist view, do not seem work for us to understand the agency or the quality of a moral actor on the side of artificial systems. So do you have any other options? Finally, we have relational approach. So here we go. According to the relational approach, robots of AI systems have moral agency, not simply because of their cognitive states and functional abilities, but because of the way they interact with human beings and the way they cooperate with human beings to come to support moral and social values. These sound very abstract, I know, but it's really the beginning. So why don't we see things from the perspective of certain relations and interactions instead of certain type of internal abilities and internal states? That's the whole philosophy behind relational view. So here, relationalism, it's a new terminology, refers to this new approach in robots' moral agency, moral standing, and moral rights. It is an open and interactive approach that focuses on how artificial systems interact with human beings in a social, relational context. I heard many of these things during the conference yesterday and today. So really have to think about how we interact with these artificial systems, and that's the context we can recognize, we understand their moral agency. Excuse me. In contrast to the property-based approach, where a certain group of cognitive and affective properties define the qualities of moral agency and moral standing in isolation, the relational approach brings in the social and interactive dimensions of moral agency. I guess this is a really important sentence that really captures the whole idea of my presentation. So what that means is the traditional view, standard view, and functionalist view is really ontology. It looks at what the system has in its own. So do they have some ability X, Y, Z? Do they have some internal states X, Y, Z? And from there, certain accent behaviors come out. So these are the questions we ask. But if we're going to this side of picture, relational approach, they say, wait a minute, we don't do that. We have to think about some kind of an interaction and relation. So if we do that, then we may have some good understanding of artificial moral agent. So here is a big quotation by Cetra in 2021 article, a quote, rather than ascribing moral standing on the basis of characteristics of the entity. Yes, right? That's basically the idea of standard view. That's a property-based approach. The very fact that we relate with other entities become the basis for obligations and claim for moral consideration. As with the traditional types of relational theories, what matters is not necessarily whether or not the others are like us, or if we ourselves reflect in them, but rather how these others become actors in our social structures with which we interact. In robot relationalism, the fact that we relate to robots is taken as an indication that these entities are, in fact, nodes of value due to these relations, end quote. So that's the whole idea of relational approach, and here's a quick diagram to show these three different views. So first of all, we have standard view, which is ontology-based theory, property-based theory. So we have to look at that system itself, and we check out whether the system has certain kind of properties. In the functionalist view, we look at the functions. But they both have some issues, specifically responsibility gap or anthropocentrism. On the other hand, relational approach look at the relationship. So we really have to ask what kind of relation, what kind of interaction we have to the system that makes the system as a moral agent. That's the question. And here I can give you some examples. First of all, we do have some synthetic artificial agent, artificial person. We have that right now. Yeah, other than humans or perhaps some animals or perhaps God of Christianity or God of Judaism or Islam. So these are personal gods and the humans are person. So these are examples of actual agents. But do we have artificial synthetic agent? Yes, we do. The one good example is corporate person. It's called the legal person. Yes, legal person. It's a person, right? But the interesting thing is legal person is a person, but that's not AI person. AI person is different category. And the legal person is a person because it's collective human beings is forming some kind of a business corporation. And the business corporation has something called the corporate internal decision structure. So that parallels with certain kind of beliefs and desires and intentions. So that parallels standard view. But robot agent or AI agent is totally different situation because these systems don't have beliefs and desires. So that's kind of challenging. But if we go to relational view here, relational view is a little bit free to look at things from the perspective of relations. So from what I think, it's a little bit of a, needs a little bit of imagination. The closest one that I can think is credit worthiness. So for a person to borrow money from bank, the person should show credit, right? So I have this credit, so I can borrow money from you, the financial institution. Now, credit doesn't come like this, no. The credit history is required. So think about credit history. Credit history means the person is borrowing and interacting with other members of society and gradually build up history, the history of interaction. That's the idea of relationalism. So we have AI and robots interacting with us and we observe their behaviors. And at some level, their autonomous decisions reach out to the level of a meaningful relationship. And that's the point we ascribe agency. So agency is not a matter of property, inherent property, no. It's a relational property. So that's the idea of a relational view, and because of that, it can avoid any type of anthropocentrism, and it may avoid some responsibility gap. Because once the machines and AI and robots reach out to the level of enough relational interaction and reach out to the level of moral agency, then they are responsible in some way. Now, there's another interesting advantage of taking relational approach is that relational view can provide a broad perspective of how the notion of moral agency and moral responsibility can be understood in the system's interaction with human users, owners, from the viewpoint of social interaction and moral community and practical and normative consideration of artificial moral agency. So in this case, we have to think about the whole system, whole environment of interaction. And that's where this whole idea of moral agency comes from. So that's more ecological approach to moral agency. And I just summarized two different viewpoints. Basically, it's something that I discussed already. So it's ontological perspective or perceptual perspective, more a priori approach or empirical approach, and more relational approach against more intrinsic approach. So that really compares two different viewpoints. And then we quickly look at empirical studies of agency. So what do people actually think of actor or agent? And there are several studies by Gray and Wagner and many social psychologists. And according to them, artificial systems do not have the full array of qualities of moral agent or simply agent because according to them, any agent has two different variables. One is experience of affect, the ability to feel emotions. That's one side. And the other side is ability to act voluntarily. And of course, AI robots don't feel emotions, so it's a 0. And in terms of acting, it has a little bit in the middle, as you see in a small graph above. However, the interesting study performed recently is that these robotic systems, in the context of human-machine collaboration, so it's collective context, human subjects can recognize robots' agency. So that is very interesting psychological observation. So that what that means is we actually see these artificial systems, moral agency, in the context of a collaborative interaction. That's what that means. It's amazing, isn't it? Now, going to the non-Western side, if we see some of the major intellectual and religious traditions in Asia, which is Buddhism and Confucianism, we see many of these discussions. So I'm starting with Immanuel Kant and his really crystallized image of moral actor, which is autonomous human being making decisions on the basis of universalizable rationality. That's the notion of actor in Kantian philosophy. But if you look at Confucianism, we see role-specific, relation-specific moral agent. So we can think of brothers and sisters, uncles and nephews, all this array of social relations that define who they are as moral agent. And the famous Confucian scholar Roger Ames said that it's not human being, it's human becoming, meaning human beings are not completely individual entities. No, we are evolving and changing individuals as we interact with other people. So that is really the spirit of Confucianism. And of course, Buddhism is also seeing things from the perspective of interactive, contextual context. So the main idea is pratya samupada, codependent origination. If you study Buddhism, you understand what I mean by that, which is basically everything do not have inherent existence that doesn't exist. Instead, all things are codependently arising. So that's the idea of sunyata, the emptiness. So from that perspective, we understand why and how relations, interactions are important, understanding moral agency. And on top of that, I will give you one simple example that understands that kind of perspective. In South Korea, when they have a smartphone in South Korea called handphone, smartphone in the United States called the cell phone. So do you understand the difference between cell phone and handphone? Cell phone is ontology, what that thing is, independent of us, right? Its own self-enclosed system, that's cell phone. But handphone is our hand is there and the phone is there. It shows the interaction between hand and the phone, right? So I realized that how much Korean culture and philosophy is dependent upon that perception of relationalism. So that's another interesting thing. And finally, I will talk about this and then I conclude. So there are some actual scholars of artificial intelligence mentioned the importance of this element of moral agency. For example, in a recent paper, Kim and Strodler in 2023 paper argue that assigning role obligation to robots is a good way to understand and regulate artificial moral agents. They state that the Confucian notion of robotic agency, quote, is superior to the robot rights perspective because rather than being adversarial, it is team encouraging, end quote. So they really contrasting the traditional viewpoint of moral agency to the more relational-based, role and relational and interaction-based approach. If Kim and Schroeder's relationship-based approach to robotic ethics is superior to the rule-based approach of deontology, Kantian ethics has a good chance to become, Confucian ethics has a good chance to become an inspiring paradigm of artificial moral agent. Therefore, the notion of relational agency and the communal nomos notion of Confucian moral agent can provide a useful and practical model for AI ethics and artificial moral agent, specifically in the context of relational viewpoint of artificial moral agency and responsibility. And the term communal nomos is my own term. It really shows that self-governing autonomy is actually in this context relationship-based. So it's communal nomos entities. And that's the good viewpoint to understand artificial moral agency. So that really concludes my talk about 3 different viewpoints I discussed, and they have some limitations. And I discussed some advantages of relational view. And at the end of the day, it's probably the way to understand robots and AI systems because, first of all, these AI systems have humongous internal details. For example, GPT-3 has 175 billion parameters. 175 billion parameters, and that's one of the reasons they draw a lot of electricity. Yeah, that's one of the things. Now, GPT-4 has 10 times more, 1.75 some trillion parameters. Yeah, right? So, because of this complexity, we don't exactly know what's happening inside. So don't talk about what's happening inside. That is not important here. What's important is how that system is interacting with us, right, in a meaningful way. And that's the way we understand artificial moral agents. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. So this is a really intriguing talk. We have to think about what it means that artificial intelligence has an agency. So we will take a very short break, so then you can have a bio break, and then we can have a question and answers in a refreshed mind. So it's 4:37. Let's come back for 45, 8 minutes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, everybody, let's get back to our discussion. So we heard two very intriguing presentations. In a way, I think that the presentations are complementary. So Mr. Chantalangsi presented two opposite views about AI. On the one hand, there is the idea of AI as a kind of one segment of a long evolution of human history, 3.8 billion, and just AI is a part of it. And as he mentioned, Sarah Walker's work says that it is not that technology is replacing life. AI is life. So if we look at from that perspective, then there comes the issue about how about ethics and morality. So Mr. Chantalangsi proposed the opposite view by using Bernard Stiegler's idea of AI is an interruption, and it kind of fragments our attention. And he concluded, in order for us to move forward with AI, we do need certain kind of a global, multinationally collaborating certain socio-technological institute. And his paper actually ends with a question, who will do that? In the presentation, he said, there is a UNESCO. I know you work for UNESCO. But so I'd like to ask, while audience are formulating your questions, so let me ask Mr. Chantalangsi, what do you think are the conditions for such an institution? Yesterday, we talked a lot about who can do this kind of work at this point when China and US, even though they are leading this AI development, but still not too much into the kind of a democratic use of it, right? So what do you think are the conditions for such a work? And let me ask the question to Professor Suk, and then after that, we will kind of receive the questions from the floor. So Mr. Chantalangsi's presentation more has to do with the external side, public space, right? Stiegler also mentioned this civic AI. On the other hand, Professor Suk's discussion is more to do with a little bit more internal, even though he doesn't count as an internal capacity as a condition for moral agency. So he presented three different kind of approaches. Standard view, which emphasized the inner capacity as moral agency, or the functionalist views, which emphasize external behaviors as a condition for moral agency. Rejecting this both approach, he says that relational approach can be a kind of a candidate if we do think about AI's moral agency. So I'd like to ask the very basic question, what does that mean? That AI can have a moral agency, and you talk about the robot right and animal right. So when you talk about animal right, that doesn't mean that animal is going to go to the court and then sue for the rights violation. It's human beings doing it just because we think that animals deserve to better life, right? So when you talk about AI's moral agency, whose agency is that? Is it really animals' moral agency? I mean, the AI's moral agency, or human beings are looking at the moral agency of AI, so then we can have a better relationship, right? So let's start with this.
Thank you so much, Professor Park. The question is about the who and doing what, and what are the conditions for this. So my take at this point, and this is also with my cap of UNESCO representative here, is to say we have to make use of the multilateral system that already exists. And as I said, this system has a value because it is a result of a painful history to create the United Nations out of the ruins of war and violence. But as we face today the interruptions and disruption of AI, I do feel sometimes that we are underutilizing this multilateral system. UNESCO has produced, and where I say UNESCO, it's actually the governments, members of UNESCO, have produced and adopted this recommendation on ethics of AI in 2021. That is prior to the emergence of ChatGPT, you remember, a year later. That was a kind of miracle that the international community at that time has agreed to adopt the ethical principles and considerations. So the conditions, I would say, is to have a space where voices can be heard, even if these voices are not translating into actions. Let me explain myself. UNESCO is organizing every year a global forum on the ethics of AI. This year was in Thailand, in Bangkok. And one participant from a country in the global south came to me and said, you know what, this global forum looks like a forum where we discuss nuclear weapons without any nuclear power in the room. Because there was no major actor from all these big firms, tech firms, companies. There were no decision makers really that make the difference on AI from these superpowers. So he was, joking that UNESCO is creating a space for powerless people to talk about a tool that is so powerful out of their control. But precisely, I think this is what we can do as an international multilateral system, is to offer a platform that the tiny voices can be heard, even if that voice doesn't immediately translate into decisions and actions, but it comes to existence. Without these global platforms, even these tiny voices would not be able to be heard. So it's not ideal, but this is the instruments that we have at hand. It belongs to every one of us, the United Nations, and we need to make use of this in a proper way and not underutilizing it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's one of the major headaches in philosophy and AI, I think, to understand the quality of actor, not just the mechanism of artificial systems. And the question there is this the agency or the quality of actor at the level of animals? I don't think so. Or is that the level of God? Yes, God meaning something called the personal God, like for example, God of thunderstorm. No, that's not agent God, but usually Abrahamic monotheistic religions have a God of person, which is not human being, but has some quality of action and decision making. So it's neither animal nor God and nor nothing. So somewhere in the middle of nowhere, we have to find out the meaningful model of AI's agency. And what I like to emphasize is that typically, traditionally, we think of moral agency from the perspective of inherent quality of system, something that the system has in its own. It's called ontology, its own thing. It's not the matter of seeing agency, but the matter of giving agency from our perspective. Yes. So it's a matter of attribution. It's not the matter of discovering certain quality from the system itself. Right? So from that perspective, relationship is very important. And some people say, if this is the matter of ascribing and giving, then there's some chance of illusion on our side, because human beings are very intriguing species where we see agent in a lot of unnatural things, like the statue or some kind of tree or some objects. We see, oh, that's an actor, and some people fall in love with those kind of things. So in those cases, it's a deception or illusion. However, in most cases, as we see each other, as we see different things, we can see the meaning of relation or interaction. So we cannot give agency to a thing right away. No, we need time to interact. We need time to interact, and as we build up that kind of relationship, we understand what that thing is, and we understand, oh, that may be independent system making certain decisions. So that is what I'm suggesting. And we have many interesting examples of illusions, such as color. Colors don't really exist. It's a creation of human brain. So maybe at the same level, maybe perhaps agency is that kind of concept, that all these things are just a natural process of physiological, informational processes. But in some of those cases, we see a meaningful differentiation. So that is the category of agency. So the really important part of that is, first of all, we do have some artificial examples of agency. I mentioned that earlier. It's a corporate agency. It's a legal person in Korean called 법인. 법인, right? That's Korean. That means in means human. In means person. So we are able to give those non-human artificial entities, we're giving them the status of agency. So the question is, why not? We can give other things agency from different perspective. So that's what I'm thinking, and it's one of the big things in artificial intelligence, but hopefully we can kind of make certain conceptual foundation to understand what these things are. So it's a totally new thing. AI is a totally new thing. AI is helping us or maybe harming us, right? But it's all in some way up to our interaction. It's not up to us because it's so powerful. But in our interaction with the AI, we may have find a way to identify what that thing is and to understand their agency. Thank you.
You would like to say something more? So anybody have any questions? Yes, Professor Kim. Okay.
저는 석 선생님한테 질문을 좀 드리겠습니다. 그 모럴 에이전시 문제 관련해가지고 서양 철학에서 보면은 그러니까 근대 들어서 이제 그 개인의 존재가 부각이 되면서 예전에는 이제 그 개인의 자유의지가 신의 자유의지에 종속돼 있다. 그러니까 인간의 과연 자유의지가 있느냐, 이 문제가 굉장히 중요한 문제로 부각이 되었던 것 같아요. 근데 이제 신이 철학의 그림에서 사라지면서 결국 이제 개인이 어떤 자유의지의 측면에서 그래서 내가 내 주체가 되어서 소위 moral agency가 해서 오토노미 차원에서 autonomous individual의 그 will로서의 이제 저걸 가지게 되는 건데, 지금 이제 선생님은 AI에 대해서 moral agency로서 말씀을 지금 릴레이셔널한 관점에서 이야기를 하고자 하는데, 과연 우리가 릴레이셔널한 관점에서 에이전시가 뭔가를 과연 잘 이해할 수 있는가라는 문제 한 가지 하고, 그 다음에 두 번째로는 보통 우리가 에이전시 개념 할 땐 단순히 그 오토노머스 뭐 혹은 오토노미라든가 그 라이트의 문제, 개인의 권리의 문제뿐만 아니라 사실은 그 도덕적 책임, responsibility, punishment, 아까 법인 개념 얘기하셨지만 법 인격체로서 그것은 단순히 권리만 가질 뿐만 아니라 법적 책임도 지고 그렇잖아요. punishment도 글로 갈 수가 있고. 근데 이제 AI 같은 경우 과연 우리가 그런 이야기를 할 수 있을 것인가, 거기까지 확장할 수 있을 것인지, 그걸 확장할 수 없다면 AI agency라고 하는 것이 굉장히 공허한 개념이 될 수 있지 않을까, 이런 생각이 들거든요. 그래서 우리 아까 연좌제 얘기도 권 선생님 말씀하실 때 나왔지만은 사실 relational self 개념으로 우리가 가게 되면 연좌제 개념도 저절로 따라 나온 거거든요. relational한 것들이 책임을 져야 되고 하니까. 그래서 이게 간단한 문제는 좀 아닌 것 같아요. 그래서 선생님 그 문제에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지. 예.
네, 감사합니다. 김 교수님. 말씀하신 대로 그 책임성 그리고 잘못된 결정을 내렸을 때 그 벌을 줄 수 있는 거, punishability, 영어로는 culpability라고 하는데 그 내용이 사실은 이 moral agency 문제에 있어서 가장 중요한 문제이거든요. 그래서 제가 이제 간단하게 제 생각을 정리해 보겠습니다. 첫 번째로 기본적으로 우리 그 인간들의 상식적인 수준에서는 기계에 대해서 벌을 준다는 그런 게 직관적으로 이해가 안 됩니다. 그래서 실제로 사회 심리학에서 이렇게 측정을 했을 때 사람이 기계에 대해서 뭐 기계가 잘못됐을 때 막 벌을 주고 이것은 이제 이해가 안 되는데 아까 제가 프레젠테이션 할 때 잠깐 언급을 했었는데 일단 그 기계를 콜렉티브 인바이먼트 그러니까 인간과 협동을 하는 그런 환경에 나왔을 때에는 그 사람이 물론 이제 거기 협업을 하니까 사람이 있을 거죠. 그러니까 그 사람에 대해서 에이전시를 물론 인정하고 그 기계에 대해서도 사람과 협동하는 그 협업자로서의 그 에이전시를 지각을 한다 이런 연구들이 많이 나왔습니다. 그래서 이제 그것을 유추해서 본다면은 만약에 이제 그 벌을 줄 수 있는 가능성이 있다면은 그러니까 그 협업하는 사람과 기계가 함께 벌을 받게 되겠죠. 그러니까 이제 기계만 딱 따로 내서 이걸 벌을 준다든지 그것은 개념적으로 좀 맞지가 않는데 왜냐하면 제가 계속 그 릴레이셔널리즘을 말씀드렸기 때문에 이 기계 자체를 갖고 에이전시가 있다 없다 하는 것은 약간 어불성설인 것 같고 기계가 항상 어떤 인간과의 어떤 관계를 유지하는 그런 그 시각에서 에이전시를 갖다가 이해할 수 있기 때문에 만약에 뭐가 잘못됐다면은 기계와 그것과 함께 협업한 사람이 이제 같이 어떤 특정한 벌을 받겠는데 만약에 뭐 벌이라 해봤자 뭐 이제 시스템을 종료시킨다든지 기계 같은 경우는 아니면은 뭐 협업자가 인간이니까 인간도 약간 거기에 합당한 어떤 벌을 받게 된다든지 그런 이제 생각을 해봤습니다. 근데 이게 이제 약간 일단은 전반적인 이론적인 모델로 제시가 되었기 때문에 그 벌칙에 관한 문제에 대해서는 좀 더 이제 논의가 세밀한 논의가 필요할 거라고 생각을 하고 일단은 이제 제 생각을 정리해 봤습니다. 감사합니다.
예, 감사합니다. 벤머클럽 교수님.
Yes, thank you for these two insightful talks. All what was present in the first lecture given by Professor Chantalensky was completely absent in the other lecture. That is to say, the anthropological and political side. And Professor Seok, I was just wondering if it is possible to speak about responsibility without mentioning the political and anthropological side. And also in your model of relationality, there is a kind of dilution of responsibility. We don't see what could be a person in a trial, in criminal situation, who can really respond of actions.
Thank you for your very insightful question. As you mentioned, when we talk about responsibility, responsibility is not limited in certain specific actions and behaviors. It has broad horizon of social and political implications. And the one that I just talked about is just the beginning. And we need to talk about this broad context of social political environment. There always be deceptive maneuvers by large corporations and super elites that you mentioned and also discussed in yesterday's talk. So the whole idea there is this is information technology and engineering, and it should be, that this is my own personal viewpoint, and I think you all also agree that it should be part of humanities, because it's not just a tool. It also affects us. We become more like AI, but AI should become more like us. And in between, we have politics, we have economy, we have environment, we have capitalism, we have war, we have healthcare, right? Most of these things are interconnected. This huge network of system could be more than 1.75 trillion parameters, more than that, right? So we have AI, but we have more complicated network outside of AI. And that is the opportunity for humanities in some way. So I absolutely agree. Even though my presentation is quite limited, I didn't mention this whole horizon, but we really have to discuss, as we discuss moral agency of systems, we have to include that discourse of politics and social issues. I absolutely agree. But again, that is something we need to discuss more. So, but thank you very much for your intriguing and insightful question. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. Hello, is it? Thanks so much for inviting me to have a wonderful chance to share your idea and probably my simple and very raw ideas. I'm going to remind you one of the Nobel Prize laureate, Daniel Kahneman, the slow and fast thinking. Mr. Chairman, you might be interested in this already. Well, in his theory, we all know that humans have two kinds of mind. Fast thinking and slow thinking, and fast thinking is more like calculations, and versus slow thinking is more reasoning, pause and deliberate and decision making. Well, I'm interested in whether AI can think slowly, like a second system, and it gives human reasoning in depth, and it's conscious and a sense of responsibility. So we live in this age of artificial intelligence that can imitate almost all possible human thinking, analyze, calculate, and even generate what looks like reflection. I don't know whether it can really reflect something or not, but it can imitate, So my question is, can a machine pause, reconsider, and its own assumption, and it weighs meaning or value the way humans do when more and emotional stakes are involved? Well, if AI someday later learn to simulate the reflective process, not just to calculate or imitate outcome, but to understand the consequences, then will that be the moment that it crossed the line from the computation to conscious reasoning? And it could be any of you guys or both of you want to share your own deep thinking, slow thinking ideas. I'll be really appreciate. Thanks so much.
Okay, so if there are more questions, we'll select. Oh, all the way back. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much. Both the presentations are very useful. But my question is addressed to Professor Sok. Thank you so much for bringing that threefold distinction with regard to agency, moral agency specifically. In the first one, when we were talking about standard view, later on you just mentioned that it is an ontological perspective. That's where I stopped. Because ontological studies in the recent past understand in twofold way, substance ontology and relational ontology, right? So it's probably the standard view is staying with substance ontology and it's not taking relational ontology into consideration. So if it takes that, then the relational perspective that you are offering, that you want to support, is very much with ontology. And if you, yesterday I was responding to our keynote speaker, I was mentioning about on relational ontology, which is very important now, especially when we look at the relation between AI and human. So that's number one. Number two is, this is more interesting because you brought in Buddhism into discussion. Especially, you spoke about pratitya samutpada. Pratitya samutpada can be understood in terms of relational ontology, but it's not external relations. Okay? It is a constitutive relation. When you understand something arises because of causes and conditions which constitute its existence, it is more of a constitutive relation than external relation. But in your explanation, you seem to be going with external relational ontology. So there is a gap in between these two, which I want you to take note of. But otherwise, I really enjoyed listening to the presentation. Thank you so much for that.
So if there's a question, we'll collect one more question, and then the speakers will answer three people. Yes.
Let me talk a little. I am Director General for Humanities and Social Science in NRF, Professor John, and my major is commercial law, law school professor. I have some questions. Legally, accountability is for humans. Legally, accountability is for humans. But accountability for non-human beings, AI, is hard to understand. Yes, one question. That's all.
So the question of, I take it from your question is about, can AI system reasons? In other words, can AI comprehend or understand as we understand, as we define, comprehension together as humans? I'd like to maintain a statement that I've heard one day that I found brilliant, explaining AI, and that statement is, AI calculates but doesn't understand. I'd like to believe that even in ChatGPT 50, we could still maintain that statement. Because I do believe that it's really about a system that uses big data to calculate and imitate, as you well said earlier, human behaviors or reasonings. But I do not think that the comprehension aspect as defined, as you are talking about ontology and the inner part of human being, I don't think that is replicable mechanically into AI. That is the first part of my answer, is that I hope that we can maintain, even in ChatGPT 50, that the system calculates well, better than us, but doesn't understand in the literal sense of understanding and comprehension. Secondly, what I feel is extremely important in this relational, dynamics that you've mentioned, is how do we cultivate, apart from interaction with the AI, how do we cultivate and nurture our capacity to think from the younger age, like Professor Ben Makhlouf yesterday mentioned. From the very young age, we have this extraordinary capacity to reason and to ask questions and to also to contradict. How do we meaning governments, schools, curriculum, how are we going to prepare this? And this is, I think, more important than, understanding whether AI is going to take over. It's how do we prepare our generations and our young generations to really even perform better than us in terms of understanding, reasoning, building relations and deliberations, having doubts and having hesitations. These are the kinds of qualities that I think will transform the education system as a whole. But I'm not sure that we are up to the speed at the moment. The education system is still perceiving AI as being very powerful, very speedy, and the system is lagging behind and needs to catch up. I don't think so. And interestingly, in the report that UNESCO did with the Thai government, that is called the Readiness Assessment Methodology on Ethics of AI in Thailand, one recommendation I find extremely important and interesting was under education sector. And it says, because AI is so prevalent, is so present and pregnant today, the education system and curriculum needs to invest more attention in traditional disciplines that cannot be found in our relationship with AI, meaning development of creative thinking, development of critical thinking, quality education in the classroom, interactions with peers and with the teachers. So the Thai report insists a lot on nurturing this new old education that is really central, because we can't find that in the interaction with the system. So education is not about adding information, because that is taken care of by AI better than us. So the teacher has to also reform themselves to have that capacity to develop and nurture these kinds of capacities and competences that are so much vital in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'm going for the first question. Daniel Kahneman's slow and fast thinking is system 1 cognition and system 2 cognition. And that's a really interesting division of the way we think and make decisions. The one thing that popped on in my mind is to think of something along the line of new development in AI. It's called the HRM, hierarchical reasoning model, hierarchical reasoning model, and that uses two different processes. The one is more detailed and quick and regular process. The other one is kind of slow, and that really parallels with Daniel Kahneman's idea. So one of the advantage of HRM is uses less energy, and it can be very effective, and that can solve some of the issues of a more conventional system, which is what is that? HBM, high broadband memory. Yeah, that's something that Jensen Huang's company produces right now. That draws a lot of electricity. So again, it's combination of those processes that make AI more efficient. So that's quite interesting kind of a connection application of something that we learn from how human mind and brain functions and apply that in AI context. So again, mind went through this whole process of evolution, and because of that, there are many advantages that we don't know. So as we study mind, we understand AI. We understand AI, we can understand mind too. So it's kind of mutual process of understanding. So thank you for the question. And the next question the professor asked was about ontology. So I agree. First of all, that there's a substance ontology and relational ontology. What I discussed today is substance ontology. Typical philosophy, metaphysics developed by Aristotle, Plato, and on, maybe Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz in Western modern philosophy. They all talk about substance is something that can exist on its own, right? So that is the general perspective of standard view, but relational ontology could be different. So that's something that I discussed. So thank you for clarification. And also talked about codependent arising, pratya samuppada, and it's a huge network. So the one I discussed is very simple bit of this whole network, which is our interaction with machine. But to think about this interaction, we have to think about other previous conditions, right? So why did we develop AI? And the first to begin with, and also there are a lot of other things. So again, my perspective is very limited part of this huge cosmic network of codependent arising. So thank you for your clear articulation. Thank you very much. And the last question that Professor asked was accountability for human beings. I basically agree, right? We are accountable, we are responsible. However, the reason we discuss AI accountability, AI responsibility is because AI become more autonomous. Now, first of all, why AI become more autonomous? Well, AI technology advanced, yes. But on the other hand, that's because we need that. We need that autonomous functions. For example, Tesla's autopilot system. So making its own decisions, of course, humans monitor the motion of the car most of the time, but in certain situations, car makes its own decisions. And we expect that and we want that. And that's why we have these kind of systems right now. So autonomy is the key. It's because of that capability, at some point we have to ask certain accountability, even though these are not human beings. So that's my answer to the question. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to kind of take our discussion to the really foundational level. In other words, this is a panel on bias, and we all know that the AI bias has various different layers. Obviously, there is a data collection, which is meaning that the data are collected by only certain group, so some groups' data are excluded. And there comes a kind of algorithmic design by the AI company, and their kind of lobbying, and the computational capitalism, all these big, big names. But at the bottom, there are a lot of everyday users, like myself. So when we think about AI bias, and if we take it as a problem we will have to deal with, how would you address this issue? What would be the, how would everyday users engage with this issue? Right? And that also involved education, and we are all educators, but I'd like to hear your voice because it's on a bias, and the bias is so thick and deep, and there might be not much that individual can do, but there should be some way that we can try to deal with this issue at that level.
Thank you so much, Professor Park, for bringing this issue of bias to, let's say, a political question. And I'd like to do that with you. So you said the users. Yeah. I'd like to ask here, who has trained AI? Have you trained AI machines? Can you raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4. So my other question is then, Are you using Google Map? Who is using Google Map? Yeah, so you have trained AI, right? By using AI, we train AI. And this is what is interesting for us, because we are victims in a certain point of view, because we're victims of the biases. At the same time, we are also participating in the multiplication and systemization of those biases. And I think this is something that is quite unique in the history, where we feel the sense of losing control of agency, in this particular case, to somebody, somewhere. And this is something that is extremely, it can be a great source of panic. My answer to this, and I will come back to Bernard Stiegler's proposal. In his term, he said we have to nurture our milieu, you know, our environment. And this is why I mentioned earlier, you know, we have to nurture our local community life, libraries, you know, local shops and trades, schools, municipal lives. And this is where it could sound like not really powerful, but I do think that on the long term, if we don't nurture our milieu, this is the major threat that I feel on the long term, because then it means that the extractive industry will continue with our consent and participation in the acceleration of that. So the cultivation of the milieu is, for me, a very, of course, very slow, but very needed and vital thing that we have to do. And this is why education is, of course, at the core, but we need to be aware and also reform and transform education in accordance with this speed.
Yes, thank you for your wonderful answer, Phineas. Thank you for that. Yeah, we learn a lot each other. Okay, so from user's perspective, what do we do? What do we think of? I'm teaching right now in my university AI ethics course, and I repeat this to my students many, many times. I'm asking, do you know what is the most important thing in AI? And students answer all these different ways. And yeah, of course, there are different answers. From my perspective, the most important thing in AI is learning. Learning, yes, it's a system of learning. That's the most important aspect of AI. And of course, there are different ways of learning: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, reinforcement learning, you know, deep learning, machine learning, all sorts of varieties. But in terms of AI ethics, we have to think about where that AI software or robotic system come from. Specifically in the learning process, there are two major issues. One is quantity. So learning comes from data, examples, and examples come from cyberspace that's provided by us, right? The problem of quantity is the number of examples, number of data is small, right? So in that case, system overgeneralize, right? That gives some kind of bias. So that's the one major issue. Quality, issue of quality, there are two major issues. One is the data is in some way does not have diversity. So the number of data is enough. There are so many data, but coming from the same source, right? And that doesn't give us clear understanding of what's going on. So the examples coming from different sources, representing different race, ethnic groups, educational groups, economic statuses, different societies, different cultures, right? So there's a joke in American psychology. saying that the study that is done in psychology department is studying college student psychology. Why? Because the data comes from college volunteers. That's the one major issue of learning in terms of quality. The other issue of quality is more critical issue, which is because the examples and data coming from cyberspace, and cyberspace is depository of our internet usage that reflects, maybe unconsciously, our hidden bias. So in some way, learning from those, good number, no problem, good diversity, no problem. But if these examples hiding certain kind of human bias, and system learns human bias, system replicates human bias. So these are the things that we can think of in terms of quantity, in terms of quality. So always asking some critical questions. Where does this come from, right? And is this showing diversely different examples? Does this reflect human bias? There are tons of examples. So these are some of the critical questions we ask as a user side. But remember, these examples coming from us. So it's kind of interesting cycle out there. So, thank you very much.
So we talk about the slow and the fast thinking, and in a similar context, there is a concept, fast violence and slow violence. Fast violence is something very visible, like war, rape, and things like that. But slow violence is social bias, discrimination, which we usually do not consider violence, but which is as damaging as fast violence. And if we think about the kind of bias that's generated by AI in the context of violence, I think we can see it more urgently and think about how we should deal with it. And Mr. Chantalangsi, you have something to say. Yeah.
I just wanted, before we end, because we now have to conclude, sorry to be disobedient regarding time. I just wanted to, because listening to Professor Sok early on, when you talked about the inner side or inner reality, as opposed to the relational dynamics, I was thinking of this book by Jean Baudrillard, you know, the French philosopher that is called America. It was written in 1986. And there was one image that I wanted to use here. He was talking about these joggers in California at that time. And he was very impressed by how they run back and forth, you know, as a machine, without any, in a kind of mechanical way of running. And now if we relate that to the joggers that we see today, measuring, you know, our heartbeat, blood pressure, and whatever, the miles and the distance that we do, this is the kind of image that I see where it's basically emptying somehow the inner parts of individuals, transformed into a set of data, measurable data, extractable data, that are used for, you know, models that replicate biases. But at the same time, we are in that kind of voluntary servitude in which we measure and we run. And I'm sure that in Seoul or in Korea, main cities, we saw a lot of joggers measuring their own, you know, measurements. And I think that is the perfect image for me of the phenomenon where we have to be aware and cultivate the milieu. How can we avoid emptying the inner part of individuals into quantitative data sent to wherever we don't know? And how can we cultivate the inner part and the milieu that goes with it? Otherwise, I think we will end up, you know, jogging without any destination, without any purpose, other than being extracted from by some devices for other purposes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. With that note, we conclude this session. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thanking our moderator as well.
잠시